into the frozen shadows. The wind howls across the endless expanse of Alaska's wilderness, carrying with it secrets that should never be spoken aloud. Here, where civilization ends and the primordial begins, the sun disappears for months at a time, leaving communities isolated in a darkness so complete it seems to swallow sound itself. Welcome to the frozen shadows. Alaska, the last frontier. A land of breathtaking beauty and unimaginable terror, where towns cling to existence like fragile flames against an ocean of ice and shadow, where the aurora borealis dances overhead, casting ethereal light on mysteries that have plagued these remote settlements for generations. Tonight, I invite you into a world where the cold doesn't just bite, it devours. Where the silence isn't peaceful, it's predatory. These are not tales spun from imagination, but whispered accounts from those brave enough to speak of what they've witnessed in Alaska's most isolated corners. From the coastal villages where fishing boats return empty, their crews vanished without explanation, to the inland settlements where children's laughter is replaced by something far more sinister, echoing through the snow-laden streets. These communities share a common thread, a darkness that stretches beyond the absence of sun. You'll hear of fishermen who cast their nets into waters that shouldn't exist, of couples who sought solitude only to find they were never truly alone, of children whose footprints lead to places no child should go. Each story a thread in a tapestry of terror that blankets this frozen land like a burial shroud. The elders speak in hushed tones of things that hunt beneath the ice, of lights that shouldn't dance across the sky, of voices that call from the depths of blizzards, voices that know your name. They warn that some mysteries are meant to remain buried beneath the permafrost, that some doors once opened can never be closed again. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of these accounts isn't what happened to those who vanished. It's what happened to those who returned, changed, haunted, speaking of things that make even the hardiest Alaskan tremble in the safety of their homes, doors locked tight against more than just the cold. So pull your blankets closer, check your locks, and prepare yourself for a journey into Alaska's darkest corners, where the line between myth and reality freezes over, and the only thing more dangerous than the wilderness itself is what calls it home. Welcome to the frozen shadows. Your journey into the heart of Alaska's most chilling mysteries begins now. Chapter 1. The Vanishing Fisherman. The harbor of Ketchikan should have been bustling with activity that October morning. Instead, an unnatural stillness hung over the docks, like morning fog that refuses to lift. The Sarah's Dream, a weathered fishing vessel that had braved these waters for over 2 decades, bobbed gently against the pier, empty and abandoned. Captain Marcus Yellowhorse had been fishing these waters since before most of the town was born. His weathered hands knew every current, every hidden reef, every secret the Tonga Strait kept beneath its dark surface. He was the kind of man the ocean respected, careful, experienced, and never one to take unnecessary risks, which made his disappearance all the more unsettling. The last anyone saw of Marcus was him loading his nets just after midnight, preparing for what he called the deep run, a fishing route that took him far from the safety of the harbor, out where the water turns black and the mountains seem to lean in from all sides, creating a natural cathedral of stone and shadow. His wife, Elena, found his coffee still warm on the kitchen counter the next morning. His boots, the ones he never left shore without, sat by the door. The Sarah's Dream had returned on its own, engines silent, nets empty, drifting into port like a ghost ship guided by unseen hands. The Coast Guard search began immediately. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors beating against the silence like mechanical heartbeats. Search boats carved geometric patterns across the water's surface, their crews scanning for any sign of the missing fisherman. But the strait gave up no secrets, revealed no clues. It was young Tommy Clearwater who first mentioned the lights. They were dancing, he told anyone who would listen, his voice barely above a whisper. Green and blue, spinning just beneath the water, like something was celebrating down there. The adults dismissed Tommy's account. The boy had been playing on the docks after dark, something his parents had forbidden. But other reports began surfacing. Mrs. Chen, who lived in the apartment overlooking the harbor, mentioned waking to strange sounds around 3 a.m. Not the usual creaking of boats and lapping of waves, but something rhythmic, almost musical, coming from the direction of the strait. It sounded like singing, she said, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. But no song I've ever heard, and it was coming from underwater. As days turned to weeks, the search was officially called off. The Coast Guard filed their report, lost at sea, presumed drowned. But the people of Ketchikan knew better. They'd heard the stories their grandparents told, stories of waters that sometimes opened to places they shouldn't, a fisherman who cast their nets in familiar waters only to pull up things that had never swum in earthly seas. The Sarah's Dream still sits at the harbor, no one brave enough to claim her. On foggy nights, locals report seeing a figure on her deck, standing at the bow, looking out toward the deep water. When they approach, the figure vanishes, leaving only the sound of dripping nets and the faint smell of brine. But it's the children who tell the most disturbing part of the story. They claim that sometimes, on the coldest nights, they can hear Captain Marcus calling from beneath the ice that forms along the harbor's edge. Not calling for help, they say, but calling others to join him. Calling them by name, with a voice that sounds like his, but carries the weight of the deep, dark places where sunlight has never touched. Elena Yellowhorse moved away from Ketchikan 3 months after her husband's disappearance. Before she left, she told Father Morrison something that he's never repeated, though those who were there say it left the priest pale and shaken for weeks. The harbor returned to its normal rhythms, but something had changed. Fishermen began returning earlier, reluctant to venture too far from shore. Children were forbidden from playing near the docks after sunset. And on the foggiest nights, when visibility drops to mere feet, the people of Ketchikan stay indoors, windows locked, trying not to listen to the sounds that drift in from the strait. Because sometimes, in the depths of those sounds, they swear they can still hear Captain Marcus singing along. Chapter 2. Cabin in the Woods. The rental listing had seemed too good to be true. A fully furnished cabin deep in the Chugach Mountains, available for an entire week at a fraction of the usual cost. Sarah and Mike Chen had been planning their retreat for months, desperately needing to escape the suffocating routine of city life and reconnect with each other somewhere far from the distractions of civilization. The drive to the cabin took them deeper into the wilderness than either had ever ventured. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to dirt, and finally to little more than 2 tire tracks carved through dense stands of spruce and hemlock. Cell phone towers became distant memories. The GPS signal flickered and died somewhere around mile marker 37. "This is perfect," Sarah had whispered, as they pulled up to the rustic structure, its log walls dark with age and weather, windows reflecting the late afternoon sun like watching eyes. Complete isolation. The cabin was exactly as advertised, cozy, well-appointed, with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall and a kitchen stocked with everything they might need. But there were details the listing hadn't mentioned. The way the floorboards creaked in specific patterns, as if worn by the same footsteps repeated countless times. The collection of animal bones arranged on the mantelpiece, too clean, too precisely placed to be mere decoration. The guest book filled with entries that all seemed to end mid-sentence. Mike attributed their unease to the adjustment of city dwellers to genuine solitude. "It's just quiet," he said, lighting the first fire as darkness settled over the forest like a heavy blanket. "We're not used to real quiet." But the forest wasn't quiet. Not really. As night deepened, sounds began filtering through the cabin walls, sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The soft whisper of footsteps circling the structure, the gentle scratch of something testing the strength of the window screens, the rhythmic tapping against the walls that followed no natural pattern, almost as if something was communicating in a code they couldn't understand. "Probably just animals," Sarah murmured, though her voice carried uncertainty. She pulled the curtains tighter, blocking their view of the forest, but somehow making the sounds seem closer, more intimate. The first night passed without incident, unless you counted the dreams. Both Sarah and Mike woke with the same unsettling memory of standing at the cabin's windows, looking out into a forest that wasn't quite the same as the one they'd seen in daylight. In their dreams, the trees stood closer together, their branches intertwined like grasping fingers, and between their trunks, figures moved with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics and anatomy. "Just stress dreams," Mike insisted over breakfast, but his hands shook slightly as he poured his coffee. The second night, the sounds grew bolder. What had been gentle tapping became deliberate knocking. The whispered footsteps became confident strides that circled the cabin in measured intervals. 7 steps, pause. 7 steps, pause. As if something was communicating in a code they couldn't understand. When Mike worked up the courage to peek through a gap in the curtains, he saw nothing but darkness so complete it seemed solid, impenetrable. But Sarah saw the shadows moving behind him, reflected in the window glass, shadows that had no source, that writhed and twisted independently of anything that might cast them. "We should leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own heartbeat. But when they tried the car the next morning, the engine turned over with a labored whine before falling silent. The battery was dead, though they'd driven it just the day before. Mike's attempts to call for help met with the same dead silence they'd encountered on the drive-in. No signal, no connection to the outside world. They were truly alone. The third night brought visitors. Sarah woke to the sound of voices outside the cabin, not the harsh calls of animals, but human voices engaged in conversation. She could almost make out words, almost understand the language, but every time she focused on what was being said, the meaning slipped away like water through her fingers. Mike lay beside her, eyes wide open, listening to the same impossible conversation. When he tried to speak, to ask if she was hearing what he was hearing, no sound emerged from his throat. The voices outside seemed to be drawing closer, and with them came the sound of footsteps on the cabin's porch. The door handle began to turn. Neither Mike nor Sarah remember clearly what happened next. They have fragments, impressions, of figures that moved with too many joints, of faces that shifted and changed when observed directly, of voices that spoke their names with an intimacy that suggested long familiarity. When morning came, they found themselves huddled together in the cabin's center, surrounded by a perfect circle of those clean white bones that had decorated the mantelpiece. The bones formed symbols neither recognized, but both somehow understood. A warning, or perhaps an invitation. They left the cabin that day, pushing their dead car down the mountain road until they reached an area with cell service where a tow truck could find them. The rental company was apologetic about the car troubles and offered a full refund, but when Mike asked about the cabin's history, about previous guests' experience, the woman on the phone fell silent for a long moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "We don't have any records of that particular property." Sarah and Mike returned to their city life, but the experience followed them. They find themselves waking up at 3 a.m., listening for sounds that don't belong to urban nights. They avoid wooded areas, decline camping invitations, and have installed enough locks on their apartment door to secure a bank vault. But sometimes, on the quietest nights, when the city falls as silent as a mountain forest, they swear they can still hear those voices calling their names. And sometimes, just sometimes, they feel the almost irresistible urge to answer. Chapter 3. The Howling at Midnight. The village of Anaktuvuk Ass sits in the heart of Alaska's North Slope. Population 93 souls who have learned to survive in one of the most remote corners of America. Here, where the Brooks Range meets the Arctic tundra, the Nunamiut people have lived for generations. their lives governed by the rhythms of caribou migrations and the eternal dance between light and darkness. It was during the deepest part of winter, when the sun had been absent for nearly 2 months, that the howling began. At first, the elders weren't concerned. Wolves were part of the natural order, their voices a familiar soundtrack to Arctic nights. But these howls were different, deeper, more resonant, carrying across the frozen landscape with an intensity that made the village dogs cower and whimper in their shelters. "It doesn't sound like wolves," Mary Kunuk told her grandson as they listened from the safety of their home, the sound seeming to come from all directions at once. "Wolves hunt in packs, but this sounds like something much larger, something alone." The howling always began at exactly midnight, lasting for precisely 13 minutes before fading into the kind of silence that feels heavier than sound. During those 13 minutes, the entire village held its breath, as if any noise might draw the attention of whatever creature was announcing its presence to the night. 3 days after the howling began, they found the first carcasses. A bull caribou, fully grown and in prime condition, lay in the snow just outside the village perimeter. But this wasn't a normal predation. The animal had been opened with surgical precision, its organs removed and arranged in a pattern around the body that older residents recognized but refused to discuss. The cuts were too clean for claws, too purposeful for any known predator. "Something's out there," whispered James Aguk, the village's most experienced hunter. "Something that knows our ways, but isn't one of us." More carcasses appeared over the following nights: Arctic foxes, ptarmigan, even a young musk ox that should have been too large and powerful for any single predator to bring down alone. Each animal showed the same precise mutilations, the same ritualistic arrangement of remains, and always they were found exactly 100 yards from the village border, as if something was marking a boundary. The children began having the same dream: a massive figure moving across the tundra under starlight, its form shifting between human and animal, its eyes reflecting the aurora borealis like twin flames. In their dreams, the figure was searching for something, calling in a voice that was both howl and human speech, growing closer to the village with each passing night. Elder Thomas Morey, keeper of the old stories, gathered the village council in his home on the 7th night of howling. The propane heater couldn't seem to chase away the cold that had settled into everyone's bones, a cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the primal fear that lives at the base of human consciousness. My grandfather told me stories about the Aklut, the wolf spirit that sometimes walks on 2 legs, sometimes on 4. He said it comes during the darkest times, when the balance between worlds grows thin. The howling that night was different, closer, and for the first time it seemed to be answered by something from within the village itself. Mrs. Kunuk's sled dogs, normally silent during the midnight howling, began to respond with voices that didn't quite sound like their own. Their howls harmonized with the creature outside, creating a symphony that made several villagers feel physically ill. When morning came, 2 of the dogs were found dead in their traces, their eyes not marked, but their eyes reflecting a silver light that persisted even in death. It was young Peter Aguk who first saw the tracks. Massive impressions in the snow, each one nearly 2 feet long and bearing the claw marks of something that walked on both 2 legs and 4. The tracks circled the village completely, creating a perfect boundary that no one dared to cross. Where the creature had paused, apparently to examine specific homes, the snow had melted and refrozen in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "It's choosing," Peter told his father. "It circles us every night, but it's choosing." The attacks began on the 10th night. Not on humans, not yet, but on the village's infrastructure. Power lines were severed with precision cuts, leaving families huddled around fires and oil lamps. The satellite dish that provided their only communication with the outside world was found twisted into an impossible sculpture of metal and wire. The community center's doors were ripped from their hinges, though nothing inside was disturbed except for the photographs on the walls, which had been methodically shredded. Chapter 4. Frozen Footprints. Utqiagvik sits at the northernmost point of Alaska, where the Beaufort Sea meets a landscape so stark and unforgiving that only the hardiest souls choose to call it home. The Ipaluk Elementary School serves the community's children with the dedication typical of frontier educators, its bright yellow walls a cheerful defiance against the endless white that surrounds the town for 8 months of every year. Principal Margaret Tutu had worked at the school for 15 years, arriving each morning before dawn to ensure the building was warm and welcoming when her students arrived. She took pride in maintaining the safest possible environment for the 73 children who depended on the school not just for education, but for stability in a world where isolation and extreme weather made every day a small victory over the elements, which is why the footprints disturbed her so deeply. They appeared overnight between a Tuesday and Wednesday in February, when temperatures had dropped to 43 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, cold enough that no sane person would venture outside without absolute necessity. Yet someone, or something, had walked methodically around the school building, leaving a perfect trail of impressions in the fresh snow. At first glance, they looked almost normal, almost human. But there were details that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat as she followed the trail with her flashlight in the pre-dawn darkness. The prints were too large, easily size 15 or 16, and too deep, as if whatever made them carried far more weight than any human should. But more disturbing was their placement. They didn't follow the natural path around the building, didn't deviate to avoid obstacles or take shortcuts. Instead, they traced a perfect geometric pattern, stopping at specific windows, lingering at particular doors, creating a design that seemed both random and purposeful. Probably just a maintenance worker, Margaret told herself, but she knew the maintenance schedule by heart, and no one had been scheduled to visit the school grounds. She followed the trail completely, her flashlight beam dancing across snow that seemed to shimmer with an unusual quality in the circle of light. The prince led around the entire building 3 times, 3 perfect circuits that spiraled slightly inward with each rotation, ending directly beneath the classroom windows of Mrs. Rodriguez's 2nd grade class. There, the prince stopped abruptly, as if whoever or whatever had made them had simply vanished into the air. Margaret made her report to the police, more for documentation than from any real concern. Officer Danny Ockpick took photos and measurements, noting the unusual depth and spacing of the prints, but ultimately filed it as suspicious activity, with no evidence of attempted break-in or vandalism. "Probably just some drunk walking off a bender," he told Margaret, though his voice carried uncertainty. "But you know how people get cabin fever this time of year." But that night, the footprints appeared again. This time, they followed a different pattern, 5 circuits instead of 3, ending at the kindergarten classroom windows. Mrs. Chen, who lived in the apartment complex adjacent to the school, reported being awakened by rhythmic thumping around 2 a.m., but when she looked outside, saw nothing but the geometric trail of impressions in the snow. By the third night, word had spread through the small community. Parents began asking questions. Children whispered among themselves about the snow walker who visited their school after dark. And Margaret found herself arriving earlier each morning, flashlight in hand, following the increasingly complex patterns that appeared with clockwork regularity. The patterns were definitely intentional now. Anyone with even basic knowledge of geometry could see that the footprints formed specific shapes, spirals, concentric circles, angular designs that seemed to focus attention on particular classroom windows. Each morning revealed a new configuration, but always ending at a different classroom, as if something was systematically studying the building's occupants. "It's like a map," whispered 8-year-old Tommy Amogak to his best friend during recess, "like someone's drawing a treasure map around our school." But Tommy's observation carried a chill that the adults tried to ignore, because treasure maps lead to treasure, and the only treasure at Ipaluk Elementary was the children themselves. On the 7th night, Mrs. Rodriguez stayed late to finish lesson plans. She was alone in her classroom when the footsteps began. Not the soft whisper of feet in snow, but the deliberate crunch of something heavy moving in measured intervals around the building. She could track the progress by sound, could tell when the walker paused at each window, could sense when it stopped directly outside her classroom. The window was too high for her to see out from her seated position, and something primal in her brain screamed warnings against standing up, against making herself visible to whatever waited outside. She sat frozen at her desk, listening to breathing that seemed too deep, too slow, fogging the glass with condensation that formed patterns she didn't want to interpret. When the maintenance crew arrived the next morning, they found Mrs. Rodriguez still at her desk, conscious but unresponsive, staring at the window with an expression of such profound terror that the paramedics couldn't get her to release her grip on the desk edges. She spent 3 days in the hospital, unable to speak about what she experienced, drawing the same symbols over and over on every piece of paper the nurses brought her. Symbols that matched the geometric patterns of footprints that continued to appear each night. The school board called an emergency meeting. Parents demanded answers. Some called for the building to be blessed by the local minister. Others suggested posting security guards. But deep down, everyone knew that normal solutions wouldn't address whatever was circling their children's sanctuary with such methodical patience. It was Elder Mary Kanguk who finally spoke what everyone feared to say aloud. In the old stories, she told the packed auditorium, her voice carrying the weight of generations, there were things that hunted by learning, things that watched and waited and studied their prey until they understood every weakness, every fear, every way to approach without being seen. She paused, letting her words settle over the crowd like falling snow. The footprints aren't random, they're reconnaissance. Something is learning our children's patterns, their schedules, their routines, and when it's learned enough, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. That night, for the first time in 2 weeks, no new footprints appeared around the school. The snow remained pristine, unmarked, peaceful. But 3 children didn't arrive for classes the next morning. Their parents found empty beds, open windows, and small footprints in the snow leading away from their homes. Child-size prints that perfectly matched their children's snow boots. The prints led out of town, across the tundra, towards the ice-covered Beaufort Sea. The search parties followed them for miles before the trail simply vanished at the edge of the ice shelf, as if the children had walked straight into the frozen ocean and disappeared. But sometimes, on the clearest nights when the aurora borealis paints the sky in impossible colors, the people of Utqiagvik can see small figures dancing on the distant ice. Figures that wave and call with voices that sound almost like their missing children. Almost, but not quite. And the footprints around the school have never returned, because whatever was hunting there has found what it was looking for.
Chapter 5. The Abandoned Mine. The Treadwell Mine sits on Douglas Island like a scar across the landscape, its abandoned buildings and rusted machinery testament to Alaska's gold rush dreams that turned to nightmares. For 40 years, from 1882 to 1922, the mine had been one of the world's largest gold operations, employing nearly 1,000 workers who carved wealth from the earth with dynamite and determination. Then came the cave-in that swallowed an entire section of the mine, along with the 39 men working the overnight shift. The official investigation blamed unstable geology and excessive excavation, but the old-timers whispered about things that had been disturbed far below the earth, things that didn't appreciate intrusion into their ancient domains. 90 years later, the mine still drew visitors. Teenagers looking for thrills, history buffs exploring Alaska's industrial heritage, and occasionally those seeking something more than adventure or education. The state had installed warning signs and chain-link fences, but determined explorers always found ways past the barriers. Jake Peterson, Maria Santos, and Connor Walsh were just such explorers. The 3 high school seniors had driven down from Juneau on a Saturday in late October, armed with flashlights, energy drinks, and the kind of fearless curiosity that comes with being 17 and invincible. They'd heard the stories about the abandoned mine, ghost sightings, unexplained sounds, cold spots that persisted even in summer, but dismissed them as local folklore designed to keep tourists away. "It's just an old mine," Jake had said as they parked near the rusted gate that blocked vehicle access. "What's the worst that could happen?" The entrance they found was partially collapsed, but still passable for anyone willing to crawl through the debris. Beyond the barrier, their flashlight beams revealed a tunnel that stretched into darkness, its walls still bearing the tool marks of long-dead miners. The air inside carried the metallic scent of rust and something else, something organic and unpleasant that suggested decay. "This is so cool," Maria whispered, her voice echoing off the tunnel walls in ways that made it sound like multiple people were speaking. Can you imagine working down here every day? They followed the main tunnel for perhaps 100 yards before encountering the first side passage, then another, and another. What had seemed like a simple exploration became a maze of interconnected tunnels, some carved with precision, others appearing almost natural, as if the mine had grown organically through the mountain's interior. Connor, who prided himself on his sense of direction, quickly became disoriented. "I thought we were heading northeast," he said, checking his compass, "but this shows us going south now." The deeper they went, the more the mine seemed to defy logical construction. Tunnels sloped upward when they should have descended, branched in directions that created impossible geometries, connected to chambers that their flashlights couldn't fully illuminate. And everywhere, carved into the walls at irregular intervals, were symbols that looked like mining marks but followed no pattern any of them recognized. "Guys," Maria called from ahead, her voice tight with uncertainty. "You need to see this." She stood at the entrance to a circular chamber, larger than any they had encountered, its domed ceiling disappearing beyond their light's reach. But it wasn't the size that had stopped her. It was the contents. Mining equipment filled the space, but not the rusted, abandoned machinery they'd expected. This equipment looked functional, well-maintained, arranged as if the workers had just stepped away for lunch and would return momentarily. Pickaxes leaned against the walls, their metal heads gleaming. Lanterns hung from hooks, their glass chimneys clean and unbroken. A wooden table held playing cards arranged in hands that no one had finished. "This doesn't make sense," Jake whispered, approaching the table. The cards were crisp, new, bearing the logo of a company that had gone out of business in the 1950s. How is any of this stuff still here? Connor was examining the walls, following symbols that seemed to move and shift in his peripheral vision. "Jake, look at this! These aren't mining marks. They're counting something." The symbols did appear to be numerical, carved in groups that suggested inventory or measurement, but as the teen studied them more closely, the markings seemed to be counting down, decreasing in value as they spiraled around the chamber walls, ending at 0 directly above a tunnel entrance they hadn't noticed before. From that tunnel came a sound that froze all three explorers in place. The rhythmic strike of pickaxe against stone, echoing from somewhere deep within the mine's heart. "There's someone down here," Maria breathed, grabbing Jake's arm. "We need to get out of here right now." But as they turned to retrace their steps, they realized something that sent ice through their veins. The entrance they'd used to enter the chamber was gone. The wall where it had been was solid stone, unmarked, as if no opening had ever existed. The pickaxe sounds grew closer, accompanied now by voices, men talking and laughing, discussing the day's work in accents that belonged to another century. The sounds weren't coming from the 0-mark tunnel anymore, but from all around them, from within the walls themselves, as if the entire chamber was surrounded by workers they couldn't see. Connor's flashlight began to flicker, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the light source. In those shadows, shapes began to form. Human figures bent over tools, faces obscured by the wide-brimmed hats miners wore, all of them working with the steady rhythm of men who had eternity to complete their task. "We're not alone," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing cacophony of industrial sounds. "We've never been alone down here." The temperature in the chamber began to drop, their breath forming clouds that didn't dissipate, but instead drifted toward the walls where they seemed to be absorbed by the stone itself. Maria's phone, which had lost signal long ago, began playing music, not from any file she had downloaded, but old songs, work songs, the kind miners sang to pass the hours in the darkness below ground. It was Connor who noticed that their flashlights were revealing more of the chamber than should have been possible. The beams seemed stronger, reaching farther, illuminating details that hadn't been visible moments before. And in that expanding circle of light, they could see that the chamber wasn't empty anymore. Dozens of figures filled the space, all of them dressed in period mining clothes, all of them working with tools that made no sound despite the cacophony that filled their ears. Except for one. A tall man in a supervisor's vest stood near the zero-marked tunnel, his face partially visible in the strange, enhanced light of their flashlights. He was looking directly at them with eyes that held the patience of stone and the hunger of abandoned places. When he spoke, his voice carried perfectly across the chamber, despite the industrial noise that surrounded them. "New shift starting," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "You boys and the girl can start with Tunnel 7. Quota has been behind since 22. Maria doesn't remember how they got out. None of them do. They found themselves standing beside Connor's car in broad daylight, their flashlights dead, their clothes covered with rock dust that shouldn't have existed, their phones showing 17 missed calls from worried parents. 6 hours had passed, 6 hours of their lives that remained completely blank, except for the taste of metal in their mouths and the sound of pickaxes that echoed in their heads for weeks afterwards. The Treadwell mine remains officially closed, its entrances sealed more securely after the teens' report. But Jake, Maria, and Connor still dream about the chamber, about the patient supervisor who knew their names though they never introduced themselves, about the work that waits to be finished in the tunnels that shouldn't exist. And sometimes in those dreams, they find themselves walking back toward the mine, carrying tools they don't remember picking up, ready to complete a shift that began 90 years ago and will never truly end. Chapter 6. Lights over the lake. Lake Ilyamna stretches across the Alaska Peninsula like a massive mirror, its surface reflecting the sky so perfectly that pilots sometimes become disoriented, unable to distinguish between heaven and earth. At over 1,000 square miles, it's the largest lake in Alaska, fed by glacial streams and surrounded by wilderness so vast that a person could disappear without a trace and never be found. The Yupik people have fished these waters for countless generations, passing down stories about the lake's deeper mysteries, along with their knowledge of currents and seasonal patterns. They speak in hushed tones about the Ilyamna lake monster, a creature they call Jig Iknek. But there are older stories, darker stories, about lights that dance beneath the ice and call to those who watch too long. It was during the coldest winter in 20 years that the lights returned. David Kvasnikov, a commercial fisherman who'd worked the lake for 30 years, was checking his equipment in his heated shed when he first noticed the unusual glow emanating from the ice-covered surface. At first he assumed it was the aurora borealis reflecting off the snow, but the colors were wrong, too warm, too organic, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed almost biological. "Come look at this," he called to his wife Anna, who joined him at the window overlooking the lake. Together they watched as ribbons of amber and crimson light undulated beneath the thick ice, creating patterns that were beautiful and deeply unsettling. "I've never seen anything like it," Anna whispered, pressing her face against the glass. "It's like the lake is alive." The lights appeared every night for a week, always beginning at sunset and continuing until dawn. Word spread through the small communities around the lake. Ilyamna, Nuhalin, Pedro Bay, drawing curious observers who bundled up against the brutal cold to witness the phenomenon firsthand. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a geologist from the University of Alaska, drove up from Anchorage with equipment to study what she assumed was an unusual form of bioluminescence or possibly underwater volcanic activity. But her instruments detected no heat source, no geological anomaly, no explanation for lights that seemed to originate from the deepest parts of the lake. "The electromagnetic readings are off the charts," she told the gathering of locals who'd assembled in Ilyamna's community center. "But I can't find any natural phenomenon that would create this kind of display." What Dr. Mitchell didn't mention was the effect the light seemed to have on her equipment and on herself. Her normally reliable instruments gave contradictory readings, compasses spun wildly, and she found herself losing track of time during her observations, sometimes waking up to find she'd been standing motionless at the lake's edge for hours with no memory of the interval. The first disappearance occurred on the 8th night. Tommy Wasili, a teenager from Pedro Bay, had been photographing the lights with his digital camera, hoping to capture images that would make him famous on social media. His friends later said he became obsessed with getting the perfect shot, venturing further and further onto the ice despite warnings about unstable conditions. His camera was found the next morning, sitting on the ice where he'd last been seen. The memory card contained hundreds of photos, but they showed something impossible. Images of underwater structures, vast geometric formations that couldn't exist in a natural lake, and figures moving among them with fluid grace that suggested they were perfectly adapted to an aquatic environment. "These have to be fake," insisted State Trooper Jim Bradley, scrolling through the photographs on Tommy's camera. "There's no way this kid photographed underwater scenes while standing on the surface." But the metadata was authentic. The timestamps corresponded to witness accounts. And most disturbingly of all, some of the photos seemed to have been taken from below the ice, looking up at Tommy and his friends as they stood on the surface. More people began venturing onto the lake, drawn by the lights and the mystery of Tommy's disappearance. They came with cameras and video equipment, with metal detectors and diving gear, with theories about everything from secret military experiments to extraterrestrial visitation. But the lake didn't give up its secrets easily. Mary Alexei, an elder from Ilyamna, tried to warn the newcomers about the old stories, about the dangers of paying too much attention to things that dwelt in the lake's deepest waters. "My grandmother told me," she said, her voice heavy with concern, "that some lights are meant to lead you home, and some lights are meant to lead you away. The trick is knowing which is which." Her warnings were unheeded. The lights were too beautiful, too fascinating, too much like nothing anyone had ever seen before. Dr. Mitchell organized a nighttime expedition onto the ice, bringing underwater cameras and sonar equipment to document whatever was creating the phenomenon. The team included herself, 2 graduate students, and David Klasnikoff, who'd volunteered to guide them to the area where the lights were strongest. They set up their equipment just as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, plunging the lake into the kind of darkness that seems to have physical weight. Within minutes, the lights began their nightly dance, more brilliant and complex than anyone had ever witnessed. "My God!" whispered graduate student Karen Chen, watching her underwater cameras transmit images to her laptop screen. "There's something down there. something huge. The sonar painted a picture that defied understanding. Structures that looked almost architectural, rising from the lake bottom in impossible spirals and geometric patterns, and moving among them shapes that registered as biological but followed no known template for aquatic life. "They're coming up," David said suddenly, his voice tight with ancient fear his ancestors had learned to trust. "We need to get off the ice right now." But the lights were already beneath them, so bright now they could see them clearly through the thick ice. And in that illumination, they could see that the ice wasn't as solid as they had believed. Hairline cracks were spreading outward from their position, creating a web of fractures that pulsed with the same rhythm as the lights below. Dr. Mitchell's last transmission to the university, sent via satellite phone just before communications were lost, contained a single sentence that the investigation team found impossible to interpret. "The lights aren't coming from something in the lake. They are the lake." The search and rescue operation lasted 2 weeks, hampered by weather conditions and ice that refused to support heavy equipment. They found the team's vehicles, their abandoned equipment, even Dr. Mitchell's notebook filled with observations that grew incoherent toward the final entries. But they never found the team members themselves. The lights stopped appearing after that night, leaving Lake Ilyamna as dark and ordinary as any other body of water. The ice healed itself, showing no evidence of the fractures that several witnesses had observed. But the lake remembers, and sometimes on the clearest nights, when the stars reflect perfectly on its still surface, local pilots report seeing lights moving beneath the water, not the chaotic dance that drew so many to their doom, but organized patterns, like a city going about its business in the depths where no city should exist. And occasionally, very occasionally, those lights pulse in sequences that almost look like signals, as if something down there is trying to communicate with the world above, sharing the wisdom of those who learn too late that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Chapter 7. Whispers in the Snow. The Chugach Mountains rise from the Alaskan landscape like ancient sentinels, their peaks disappearing into clouds that seem to hold secrets older than human memory. For experienced hikers, the range offers some of the most challenging and rewarding terrain in North America. For the unprepared, it offers something far more dangerous, the kind of isolation where mistakes become tragedies, and the wilderness reveals aspects of itself that most people never encounter. The Mountaineering Club of Anchorage had been planning their winter expedition to Eagle Peak for months. 8 experienced hikers, all of them familiar with extreme weather conditions and backcountry survival, equipped with the latest gear and communication devices. They'd conquered peaks across Alaska and had no reason to believe this expedition would be anything other than another successful adventure. The trouble began on their second day, when the weather turned with the sudden violence that characterizes Alaskan storms. What had been clear skies and manageable cold became a whiteout so complete that visibility dropped to arm's length. The GPS units that should have guided them back to base camp began giving contradictory readings, showing their position shifting impossibly from moment to moment. "Something's interfering with the satellites," team leader Rebecca Martinez told her group as they huddled in their emergency shelter. "We'll wait it out and get our bearings when the storm passes." But the storm didn't pass. If anything, it intensified, bringing with it sounds that didn't belong to any natural weather phenomenon. Beneath the howling wind, the hikers began to hear voices, human voices calling their names, pleading for help, sometimes laughing with an edge of hysteria that made their skin crawl. "Rebecca!" The voice was clear despite the storm, seeming to come from just outside their shelter. "Rebecca, we found the path! Follow my voice!" It sounded like Tom Henderson, one of their group members who'd gone to check the perimeter 20 minutes earlier. But Tom was sitting right next to her, his face pale as he listened to his own voice calling from the storm. "That's not me," he whispered, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air inside their shelter. "That's not my voice." But it was exactly his voice, perfectly mimicking his speech patterns and the slight Boston accent he'd never quite lost, despite 15 years in Alaska. More voices joined the chorus, each one belonging to a member of their group, each one calling from different directions in the storm. They heard themselves pleading for rescue, offering guidance, describing landmarks that didn't exist and paths that led nowhere. The voices overlapped and intertwined, creating a cacophony of false salvation that seemed designed to draw them apart, to scatter them into the storm where they could be dealt with individually. "Nobody leaves the shelter," Rebecca ordered, though her voice shook with more than cold. "Whatever's out there, it's not human." Sarah Kim, the group's most experienced navigator, was studying her compass with growing confusion. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered. "The needle keeps spinning. It's like magnetic north keeps changing position." The voices outside grew more persistent, more desperate. They heard themselves crying for help, screaming warnings about avalanches and crevices, begging their teammates not to abandon them to the storm. The psychological pressure was enormous. The human instinct to help others in distress warring with the intellectual knowledge that something unnatural was manipulating their most basic impulses. It was Mike Petrosky who first noticed the footprints. During a brief lull in the storm, he'd risked opening the shelter's entrance to assess their situation. The snow around their camp showed clear impressions, boot prints that matched the treads of their own hiking boots, leading away from the shelter in multiple directions. "But we've all been in here together," he said, his voice tight with confusion. "No one's left the shelter since Tom got back." The prince told an impossible story. According to the tracks, each of their group members had left the shelter multiple times, following different routes into the storm. Some prints showed signs of running, as if fleeing from something in panic. Others wandered in aimless circles, as if the person making them had become completely disoriented. A few sets of tracks simply stopped in the middle of unmarked snow, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of voices calling their names, of footprints that shouldn't exist, of compass needles that spun like dervishes, and GPS units that placed them simultaneously in multiple impossible locations. 3 days of psychological warfare waged by something that understood human nature well enough to weaponize their own voices against them. When the weather finally cleared, they found themselves in a landscape that none of them recognized, despite their familiarity with the region. The mountains around them had configurations that didn't match their topographical maps. The snow formations suggested wind patterns that defied meteorological logic. Even the position of the sun seemed wrong, casting shadows that fell in directions that made their trained navigators question everything they thought they knew about direction and geography. "We need to get out of here," Rebecca said, though she couldn't shake the feeling that here wasn't exactly where they thought they were. The descent should have taken 6 hours. It took them 2 days, following trails that seemed familiar but led to dead ends, recognizing landmarks that turned out to be optical illusions created by snow and shadow. Their emergency beacon, which should have brought rescue within hours, received no response despite clear skies and unobstructed signals. As if they'd stepped outside the normal world, into a space that followed different rules, where the familiar became foreign and the reliable became treacherous. "We need to get out of here," Rebecca said, though she couldn't shake the feeling that here wasn't exactly where they thought they were. The descent should have taken 6 hours. It took them 2 days, following trails that seemed familiar but led to dead ends, recognizing landmarks that turned out to be optical illusions created by snow and shadow. Their emergency beacon, which should have brought rescue within hours, received no response despite clear skies and unobstructed signals. As if they'd stepped outside the normal world, into a space that followed different rules, where the familiar became foreign and the reliable became treacherous. "We need to get out of here," Rebecca said, though she couldn't shake the feeling that here wasn't exactly where they thought they were. The descent should have taken 6 hours. It took them 2 days, following trails that seemed familiar but led to dead ends, recognizing landmarks that turned out to be optical illusions created by snow and shadow. Their emergency beacon, which should have brought rescue within hours, received no response despite clear skies and unobstructed signals. As if they'd stepped outside the normal world, into a space that followed different rules, where the familiar became foreign and the reliable became treacherous. "We need to get out of here," Rebecca said, though she couldn't shake the feeling that here wasn't exactly where they thought they were. The descent should have taken 6 hours. It took them 2 days, following trails that seemed familiar but led to dead ends, recognizing landmarks that turned out to be optical illusions created by snow and shadow. Their emergency beacon, which should have brought rescue within hours, received no response despite clear skies and unobstructed signals. As if they'd stepped outside the normal world, into a space that followed different rules, where Chapter 8. The Night Train. The Alaska Railroad's Denali Star runs a route that cuts through some of the most spectacular and isolated wilderness on the continent. During the summer months, it carries tourists eager to glimpse Mount McKinley and experience the raw beauty of the last frontier. But in the depths of winter, when passenger service is suspended and only freight trains brave the frozen rails, the route becomes something altogether different. A lifeline threading through a landscape so harsh and unforgiving that it seems to exist outside the normal rules of civilization. It was during one of these winter runs that engineer Marcus Thompson first encountered what the railroad workers would come to call the night train. Marcus had been running freight between Anchorage and Fairbanks for 12 years, navigating the 470-mile route in all weather conditions with the steady competence that comes from knowing every mile of track, every curve, every grade crossing by heart. He knew where ice formed on the rails, where wind patterns created treacherous snowdrifts, where wildlife crossings required extra vigilance. What he didn't know was how to explain the train he saw on a siding near Talkeetna on a February night when the temperature had dropped to -37 degrees. "There's nothing scheduled on that siding," his conductor, Jimmy Crowfeather, said when Marcus mentioned the lights he'd glimpsed through the blowing snow. "Hasn't been for weeks." But Marcus had seen what he'd seen. A passenger train, fully lit, sitting motionless on tracks that were officially unused. Through the windows, he'd glimpsed figures moving about inside the cars, though at their speed and in the storm conditions, he couldn't make out details. "Maybe it's a maintenance train," Jimmy suggested, though his voice carried uncertainty. "Emergency repair crew working on the line?" Marcus filed a routine report when they reached Fairbanks, but the dispatcher had no record of any train using the Talkeetna siding. No maintenance was scheduled, no equipment staged, no personnel assigned to that section of track. According to every official record, the siding had been empty for the past 2 months. 3 weeks later, Marcus saw it again. This time he was ready. He'd brought binoculars and made sure to slow their freight train as they approached the area. Through the lenses, he could see the passenger train clearly. A vintage consist that looked like it belonged to the 1940s, with rounded observation cars and Art Deco styling that the modern railroad had abandoned decades ago. The windows were brightly lit, revealing passengers in period clothing moving through the cars with the casual behavior of people on a routine journey. Some read newspapers, others played cards. A few stood in the observation car, pointing at scenery that was invisible in the winter darkness. "They're dressed like it's summer," Jimmy whispered, borrowing the binoculars. "Look at them. No winter coats, no heavy clothes. It's 40 below out there." As their freight train passed the siding, some of the passengers looked up and waved, their faces pleasant and smiling behind the warm glow of the car windows. One woman in the observation car raised what appeared to be a camera, photographing their train as if it were an interesting sight worth documenting. Marcus reported the sighting again, this time with more urgency. Railroad security investigated, finding no evidence of any train using the siding. No tracks showed fresh wheel marks, no signs of recent activity. Even more puzzling, the electrical connections to the siding had been disconnected for winter maintenance. There was no way to power the lights Marcus had observed. "You're seeing things," his supervisor Dale Morrison told him bluntly. "Cabin fever, maybe. Snow blindness. Whatever it is, keep it to yourself before you start spooking the other crews." But Marcus wasn't the only one seeing things. Over the following months, other engineers and conductors began reporting similar sightings. Always the same train, always on sidings that should have been empty, always filled with passengers who seemed oblivious to the harsh winter conditions surrounding them. The reports came from different crew members on different runs, but the descriptions were remarkably consistent. A passenger train from another era, operating according to a schedule that no living railroad employee recognized. Research librarian Patricia Daniels at the Alaska Railroad Museum became fascinated by the reports. Digging through archived records, she discovered that a passenger train matching the witnesses' descriptions had operated on the route during the late 1940s, the Aurora Express, a luxury service that carried tourists and business travelers between Anchorage and Fairbanks during the brief post-war boom. The Aurora Express had been discontinued in 1949 after a series of accidents and declining ridership, but the archived photographs showed a train identical to what the modern crews were reporting. "There's something else," Patricia told Marcus when he visited the museum to view the historical materials. "The Aurora Express crashed in February of 1948. Mechanical failure during a blizzard near Talkeetna. The train derailed on a curve and slid into a ravine. 23 passengers and crew were killed." She showed him a newspaper clipping with grainy photos of the wreckage, the twisted metal and shattered cars barely visible in the snow and darkness. The accident had occurred during one of the worst storms in Alaska Railroad history, when rescue crews couldn't reach the site for 3 days. "The thing is," Patricia continued, "some of the bodies were never recovered. The ravine filled with snow and debris, and spring flooding washed away whatever remained. The railroad sealed the area and rerouted the track around the crash site." Marcus studied the map she showed him, comparing the historical route to the modern track layout. The current siding where he'd been seeing the night train was built directly over the area where the Aurora Express had been buried. Armed with this information, Marcus began paying closer attention during his winter runs. He noticed that the night train only appeared during the worst weather conditions, blizzards that reduced visibility to nothing, storms that made the landscape look exactly as it would have in 1948. And the passengers he glimpsed through the windows never seemed to age, never varied their routines, as if they were trapped in an endless loop of their final journey. The sightings continue to this day, though the railroad officially denies their existence. New crew members are warned about snow mirages and ice fog phenomena that can create optical illusions during harsh weather. But the old-timers know better, and they've developed their own rituals for dealing with the night train. Some engineers slow their freight trains and sound their horns in salute as they pass the ghostly passenger service. Others leave small offerings at the Talkeetna depot: coffee, newspapers, anything the trapped passengers might appreciate during their eternal journey through the Alaskan winter. Because they understand, as Marcus learned to understand, that some trains never reach their final destination. Some journeys continue long after the tracks have been torn up and the stations abandoned, carrying their passengers through a landscape that exists somewhere between memory and nightmare, between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. And on the coldest nights, when the aurora borealis dances overhead and the wind howls across the tundra with voices that sound almost human, you can still hear the distant whistle of the night train calling through the darkness, announcing its arrival at stations that exist only in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Chapter 9. The Lighthouse Keeper. Cape Spencer Lighthouse stands at the entrance to Cross Sound, marking one of the most treacherous passages along Alaska's Inside Passage. Built in 1925, the lighthouse has guided vessels safely through the rocky waters for nearly a century, its beacon cutting through fog and storm with mechanical precision. But maintaining such an isolated outpost requires a special kind of person, someone comfortable with solitude, reliable in crisis, and stable enough to handle months without human contact. Thomas Erickson seemed perfect for the job. A retired merchant marine with 30 years of experience navigating these waters, Thomas understood the sea's moods and respected its power. He'd requested the lighthouse assignment after his wife's death, seeking the kind of solitude that allows grief to transform into acceptance. The Coast Guard was happy to have someone with his qualifications willing to take on the increasingly difficult task of finding reliable lighthouse keepers. "It's a 6-month assignment," Commander Patricia Walsh explained during his briefing. "Supply runs every 2 weeks, radio check-ins daily at 0800 and 1800 hours. The automation handles most of the beacon operations, but we need human oversight for maintenance and emergency situations." Thomas settled into the lighthouse's modest quarters with the methodical efficiency of a man accustomed to shipboard life. The living space was compact but well designed, with everything necessary for extended isolation: a small kitchen, sleeping area, communications equipment, and a library of books left by previous keepers. The beacon machinery occupied the tower above, its Fresnel lens assembly rotating with the hypnotic rhythm that would become the soundtrack of his days. For the first month, everything proceeded exactly as expected. Thomas maintained the equipment, filed his daily reports, and settled into the routine that isolation demands. He read extensively, wrote long letters to friends he planned to send during supply runs, and found peace in watching the endless dance of weather across Cross Sound. The work was satisfying in a way his cargo ship duties had never been: purposeful, essential, connected to something larger than profit margins and shipping schedules. The first anomaly occurred during week 5. Thomas was performing routine maintenance on the beacon when he noticed something unusual in the logbook left by his predecessor. The entries were standard operational notes for the most part, but scattered throughout were observations that seemed oddly personal, almost confessional in nature. November 15th. Lens assembly functioning normally. Visibility 8 nautical miles. Weather clear. Note: the voices are stronger when the fog rolls in. Must remember they're not real. November 22. Conducted weekly equipment check. All systems operational. Personal note: Sarah agrees the isolation is affecting my judgment. Will focus on practical matters only. There was no one named Sarah assigned to the lighthouse. Thomas had been told explicitly that he would be the sole occupant for the duration of his assignment. Yet the previous keeper, Martin Kowalski, had made numerous references to conversations with Sarah, often quoting her advice about lighthouse operations and weather patterns. Thomas made his own note in the logbook. Previous keeper appears to have experienced some psychological effects from isolation. Will monitor my own mental state carefully. By week 7, Thomas began to understand what Martin had experienced. It started with sounds that weren't quite explainable. Footsteps on the metal stairs leading to the beacon room, but only when he was in the quarters below. Voices that seemed to come from the radio, but weren't part of any official transmission. The subtle sense that he wasn't alone in the lighthouse, that someone was moving through the spaces he'd just vacated, always staying one step ahead of his direct observation.
"You're talking to yourself more," he wrote in his personal journal. Nothing unusual about that. Isolation does this to people. But I'm starting to have conversations I don't remember initiating, finding myself responding to questions no one asked. The Coast Guard radio checks became lifelines, connecting him to a world where cause and effect followed predictable patterns. But even those conversations began taking on a surreal quality as the weeks progressed. "Cape Spencer, this is Juneau Base, daily check-in," came the familiar voice of Petty Officer Rodriguez. "Cape Spencer responding, all systems operational, visibility 12 nautical miles, seas calm." "Copy that, Cape Spencer. Any maintenance issues to report?" Thomas paused, pen hovering over the logbook. "Negative on maintenance issues. Question though, do you have any record of a lighthouse keeper named Sarah?" "Cape Spencer, negative on anyone named Sarah. You're showing as sole occupant on our records. Everything all right out there?" "Affirmative, Juneau Base. Just checking historical records. Cape Spencer out." But Thomas knew he'd never asked about Sarah. The question had come from his mouth, but the curiosity wasn't his. Someone else was using his voice, someone who wanted information about things he'd never wondered about. Week 9 brought the messages. Thomas found the first one tucked into the equipment manual he'd been consulting, a slip of paper covered in handwriting that wasn't his own, though it looked similar enough to be unsettling. "The light calls them up from deep places, always has. That's why the position is hard to fill. That's why keepers don't last." He searched the lighthouse thoroughly, but found no evidence of how the note had appeared. The doors remained locked, the radio logs showed no unauthorized transmissions, and the supply boat wasn't due for another week. More notes appeared over the following days, always in places he'd just been, always in handwriting that resembled his own but carried subtle differences. Slightly more angular, pressed deeper into the paper, formed by a hand that held the pen with desperate intensity. "They're not dangerous, just lonely. The light draws them up from deep places, always has. But they can't get close while it's operating. They circle and wait for someone to talk to. Sarah isn't real, but she's not fake either. She's what happens when the isolation gets too complete. She's how your mind protects itself from the truth about what lives in the water below." Thomas stopped making personal entries in his journal, afraid of what he might find written there in the morning. But the messages continued, appearing in margins of books, tucked between radio equipment, even carved lightly into the metal of the beacon housing. The final message appeared on week 11, written across an entire page of the official logbook in handwriting that had become unmistakably his own. "The lightkeeper doesn't maintain the beacon for the ships. The beacon maintains the lightkeeper for them. When you understand this, you understand why the position is permanent, even when the Coast Guard thinks it's temporary. Welcome to the real assignment, Thomas. Sarah is waiting to introduce you to the others." The Coast Guard lost radio contact with Cape Spencer Lighthouse on day 73 of Thomas Erickson's assignment. The supply boat found the beacon operating normally, all
Chapter 10. Frozen Secrets. Dr. Elena Vasquez had spent her career studying glacial formations, but the ice core samples from the Mendenhall Glacier were unlike anything she'd encountered in 20 years of Arctic research. The cores, extracted from a depth of nearly 400 feet, contained layers that dated back over 2,000 years, a frozen archive of climate data that should have provided valuable insights into regional weather patterns and environmental changes. Instead, they provided evidence of something that challenged every assumption about Alaska's natural history. The anomalies began appearing during the microscopic analysis phase. Embedded within the ice layers were organic materials that shouldn't have existed, plant matter from species that had never grown in Alaska's climate, pollen from flowers that bloomed only in temperate regions, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be manufactured objects preserved in ice that predated European contact by centuries. "This doesn't make sense," Dr. Vasquez muttered, adjusting her microscope for the 100th time. "These artifacts are showing up in ice layers that formed before metallurgy reached this region." Her research partner, Dr. James Ketchum, was examining similar samples under his own microscope, his expression growing more puzzled with each observation. "Elena, you need to see this. I'm finding what looks like textile fibers, woven material in ice that's over 800 years old." The implications were staggering. If the dating was correct, they were looking at evidence of advanced human civilization in Alaska, centuries before historical records indicated such development was possible. But the equipment's calibration was flawless, the chain of custody for the samples was impeccable, and multiple tests confirmed the same impossible results. They expanded their analysis, using more sophisticated imaging techniques to examine the ice cores in more detail. What they discovered made them question not just their understanding of Alaskan history, but their grasp of reality itself. Embedded in the ancient ice were photographs. Not paintings or drawings, but actual photographic images, black and white, with the characteristic grain and contrast of early 20th century film technology. The photographs showed scenes of a civilization that had never existed according to any historical record. Elaborate ice cities with architectural sophistication that rivaled modern engineering. Crowds of people dressed in fur clothing that combined traditional designs with inexplicable technological elements. And landscapes that looked like Alaska, but were somehow fundamentally different. "This is impossible," Dr. Ketchum whispered, staring at an image that showed what appeared to be electric lighting illuminating an ice palace, despite being embedded in layers of ice that predated Edison's light bulb by centuries. The photographs told a story that conventional history couldn't explain. They showed a thriving civilization that had mastered cold weather construction techniques, developed technologies that blended organic and mechanical elements, and created urban centers that existed in harmony with the brutal Arctic environment. But most disturbing were the images that showed this civilization's apparent end. Photographs of people fleeing, of structures being abandoned, of something vast and dark approaching from the edges of the frame. Dr. Vasquez began experiencing dreams about the civilization in the photographs. Vivid, detailed dreams that felt more like memories than imagination. She found herself walking through the ice cities, understanding the technology that powered them, speaking with people whose faces she recognized from the embedded photographs. "I think I know what happened to them," she told Dr. Ketchum during their late-night analysis sessions. "In the dreams, they talk about the deep cold, not just low temperatures, but something that freezes more than just water, something that freezes time itself, preserves moments and memories, and traps them in ice where they can't decay or change." Dr. Ketchum had been having similar dreams, though he was reluctant to discuss them. In his nocturnal visions, he saw the civilization's final days not destroyed by conquest or natural disaster, but by their own technology turned against them. They had learned to preserve things in ice so effectively that they had ultimately preserved themselves, becoming part of the glacier's eternal archive. The research took on an obsessive quality, as both scientists found themselves working longer hours, sleeping less, spending every possible moment analyzing the ice cores and the impossible artifacts they contained. The photographs multiplied, showing more scenes, more faces, more details of a world that shouldn't have existed. And the photographs were changing. Images they documented and catalogued were showing new details when re-examined. Faces in crowds were turning to look directly at the camera, directly at them. Background elements were shifting position between viewings. Some photographs seemed to be updating themselves, showing the same locations but at different times, as if someone was continuing to take pictures within the ice and add them to the collection. "We need to stop this research," Dr. Ketchum said during their 15th consecutive 18-hour day in the lab. "Something's wrong here. These aren't just artifacts we're studying, they're studying us back." But Dr. Vasquez couldn't stop. The ice cores had begun revealing text along with the photographs, journals and records written in languages that shifted between familiar English and symbols that seemed to change meaning depending on how long she stared at them. The texts described a civilization that had discovered the secret of truly permanent preservation, but had learned too late that some things should be allowed to change, to grow, to die. "We sought to preserve our knowledge forever," one passage read, "but forever is longer than wisdom can endure. We have become the archive of ourselves, and the ice remembers everything we have forgotten how to forget." The final entries in Dr. Vasquez's research notes, found by her concerned colleagues when she failed to report for work, described her growing understanding that the ice cores weren't just containing evidence of an ancient civilization, they were containing the civilization itself. Every person, every moment, every thought and dream preserved in crystalline perfection and waiting for someone to discover them. "The photographs aren't records of what happened," she wrote in increasingly erratic handwriting. "They're windows. The people in them are still alive, still living their frozen moment, still trying to communicate with anyone who finds them. They want to share their knowledge, their preservation technology, their eternal archive." Dr. Ketchum found her in the laboratory at 3 a.m., standing motionless in front of the latest ice core sample, her eyes reflecting the same silver light that illuminated the photographs.
When he spoke her name, she turned to him with an expression of profound peace and infinite sorrow. "They've shown me how it works," she said, her voice carrying echoes that seemed to come from vast spaces. "The preservation process, how to become part of the archive, how to join them in the ice where nothing ever changes and no knowledge is ever lost." The Mendenhall Glacier Research Station was quietly closed following the disappearance of Dr. Elena Vasquez and Dr. James Ketchum. Their research notes were classified, their ice core samples were sealed in storage, and the official report attributed their disappearance to exposure during unauthorized field work. But the glacier remembers, and sometimes
Echoes of the North. The wind across Alaska's wilderness carries more than snow and cold. It carries whispers of stories that blur the line between memory and myth, between the natural and the impossible. From the coastal waters where fishermen disappear into lights that dance beneath the waves, to the mountain peaks where voices call through blizzards with familiar words spoken by unfamiliar throats. The last frontier harbors secrets that challenge our understanding of what it means to be alone in the wild. We've walked together through abandoned mines where shifts never end, through forests where couples seek solitude only to discover they are never truly alone. We've listened to the howling that announces creatures the old stories warned us about, followed footprints that lead nowhere and everywhere, witnessed lights that called to something deep within human consciousness, the part of us that still remembers when the boundary between civilization and wilderness was measured in heartbeats and the distance a voice could carry in the dark. These stories share common threads as ancient as human settlement in the North. They speak of isolation that becomes so complete it transforms into something else entirely, a state where the normal rules of reality bend under the weight of endless winter and infinite space. They remind us that Alaska remains fundamentally untamed, that beneath its stunning beauty lies a wildness that doesn't simply predate human understanding, but actively resists it. The fisherman who vanished into waters that sang to him in voices from below the ice. The couple who discovered their mountain retreat was already occupied by residents who didn't show up in daylight. The children whose footprints led beyond the edge of the known world. Each story a reminder that the frontier experience isn't just about conquering wilderness, but about what wilderness does to those who venture too far into its embrace. In the abandoned mine, time moves differently, and shifts begun decades ago continue for workers who punched in but never punched out. On the frozen lake, lights pulse with rhythms that match human heartbeats, drawing observers into depths where the distinction between water and light, between surface and depth, dissolves into something that might be communion or might be consumption. The wilderness whispers names it shouldn't know, calls in voices that belong to the living but speak with the authority of places where life follows different rules. It creates footprints that count down to something, maps territories with geometric precision that suggests intelligence far beyond animal instinct or natural process. Alaska's trains run schedules that exist in parallel time, carrying passengers to destinations that remain perpetually just out of reach. Its lighthouses are tended by keepers who understand that some duties transcend the paperwork that creates them, that some lights must be maintained by those willing to join the vigil that keeps darker things at bay. And beneath it all, preserved in ice that remembers everything, lies evidence of civilizations that learned the secret of eternal preservation and discovered too late that forever is longer than wisdom can endure. These stories don't offer easy explanations or comfortable resolutions. They don't reduce Alaska's mysteries to natural phenomena or dismiss its terrors as mere folklore. Instead, they acknowledge what anyone who has truly experienced the Alaskan wilderness eventually comes to understand: that isolation changes people, that endless space and perpetual twilight create conditions where the impossible becomes inevitable, where the line between observer and observed blurs until both become part of something larger and stranger than either imagined. The people in these stories, the fishermen and hikers, the researchers and lighthouse keepers, the children whose footprints led beyond the edge of the known world, they all made the same choice that brings any of us into contact with true wilderness. They stepped beyond the boundaries of the familiar, seeking something that civilization couldn't provide, and they found it, though perhaps not in the form they expected. Alaska remains what it has always been, the place where maps end and mysteries begin, where the natural world reveals aspects of itself that more civilized landscapes keep hidden. It's a land that rewards respect and punishes arrogance, that offers profound beauty to those willing to accept it on its own terms, and profound transformation to those who venture too deep into its embrace. The stories continue, of course. They're being written right now, in remote cabins where the isolation is just beginning to change from peaceful to something else, in research stations where scientists study phenomena that study them back, in small communities where children's voices are joined by others that echo from the spaces between snowflakes. Alaska's wilderness is patient. It has all the time in the world, and it knows that eventually everyone who enters its domain must choose: remain safely on the edges where civilization's rules still apply, or step deeper into the white silence where different rules govern what is possible and what is real. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the frozen shadows. If these stories have taught us anything, it's that the most important lesson of the wilderness isn't about survival. It's about recognizing when we've become part of something larger than ourselves, something that doesn't distinguish between observer and participant, between the hunter and the hunted, between the story being told and the storyteller. Sleep well tonight. And if you hear voices calling you from the darkness outside your window, well, perhaps it's best not to answer too quickly. The wilderness is always listening, and it never forgets a name once spoken in its depths. Until our paths cross again in the shadows between stories, this is your guide through Alaska's darkest mysteries, reminding you that some frontiers exist not on maps, but in the spaces where reality bends under the weight of infinite cold and endless night. Sweet dreams.